Welcome. Take a moment to settle yourself. Perhaps you're lying down already, feeling the weight of your body against the mattress or cushions beneath you. Perhaps you're sitting, ready to let the day's tensions slowly dissolve away. Wherever you are, whatever position feels most comfortable, allow yourself to simply be there. Let your breathing slow. There's no rush, no deadline to meet, no urgency pulling at your attention. Tonight, we're going to step away from the modern world with all its speed and noise and constant stimulation. We're going to step back through time, moving slowly through the centuries, until we arrive at a quieter place, a simpler time, not necessarily an easier time, but certainly a slower one. We're going to spend an entire day with a candlemaker in medieval England. His name is Thomas. The year is 1347. The season is late autumn, November, when the days have grown short and darkness comes early. This is the busy season for a candlemaker, when people begin to think about the long winter nights ahead and the need for light to push back against that darkness. But there will be no excitement in our story tonight. No dramatic events, no battles or plagues or great historical moments. Just a slow, steady rhythm of honest work. The kind of work that filled the days of ordinary people across centuries. The kind of work that was repeated day after day, season after season. Generation after generation. Work that had its own beauty in its very ordinariness. Let yourself sink into this story. Let the gentle pace of it carry you. There's nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the images form in your mind, and allow yourself to drift. Thomas lives and works in Norwich, a prosperous wool trading town in the east of England. Norwich in 1347 is home to perhaps 10,000 souls, making it one of the larger towns in England, though it would seem quite small to modern eyes. The town sits on the River Wensum, and its prosperity comes from the wool trade. Merchants ship raw wool and finished cloth from Norwich to ports across the North Sea. But Thomas is not involved in the wool trade. His work is humbler. He makes candles, tallow candles primarily, made from rendered animal fat. These are not the fine beeswax candles that the wealthy purchase or that burn in the greatest churches. Those are made by specialized craftsmen and cost many times more. Thomas makes the ordinary candles that ordinary people use. The candles that light workshops and modest homes. The candles that burn in smaller churches and chapels. The everyday light that most people depend upon. His workshop is a small building on a narrow street not far from the marketplace. The building is typical of its time and place. Timber frame construction, with walls made of wattle and daub. A lattice of wooden strips woven with thin branches and covered with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. The walls have been whitewashed at some point, though the white has long since faded to a dingy grey. The roof is thatch. Thick bundles of straw laid in overlapping rows. There's a leak in one corner that Thomas has been meaning to repair for 2 years now. But somehow, there's always something more pressing to attend to. The workshop is perhaps 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. The ceiling is low. A tall man would have to duck his head beneath the beams. There are 2 small windows, each covered with oiled linen, stretched across a wooden frame. Glass windows would be an unthinkable luxury for a craftsman like Thomas. The oiled linen lets in light while keeping out most of the wind and rain. Inside, the space is divided simply. The main floor is where Thomas works, with his hearth in one corner, his workbench beneath the larger window, storage areas along the walls, and space in the middle for moving about. A wooden ladder leads up to a small sleeping loft above, where Thomas keeps his bed and his few personal possessions. Thomas is 43 years old, which makes him older than the average for his time. Many people don't see their 40th year. He has lived through several harsh winters, through famines and fevers, through the ordinary dangers of medieval life. His body shows the wear of his years and his labor. His hands are scarred and weathered, the fingers slightly crooked from old breaks that healed imperfectly. His back has developed a permanent slight curve from decades of bending over his work. He moves more slowly than he once did, especially in the mornings when his joints are stiff. He lives alone now. His wife Margaret died 7 years ago, taken by a summer fever that came on suddenly and killed her within 3 days. They had been married for 18 years and had never been blessed with children, though they had hoped and prayed for them. After Margaret's death, Thomas continued alone in the workshop they had shared. He thought about remarrying, but the thought never quite became action. The years passed, and he settled into a solitary routine that, if not happy, was at least familiar and manageable. Now let us begin our day, as Thomas begins his day, in the darkness before dawn, when the world is still and quiet, and most people are yet asleep. Thomas woke in darkness. Not the absolute darkness of a moonless night in the countryside, but the thick darkness of a November morning in town, when the sun has not yet risen, and the only light comes from the stars visible through gaps in the clouds. He had no clock, no way of knowing the precise hour, but his body knew. After 4 decades of life, after years of following the same daily rhythm, his body had developed its own sense of time. In the summer, he would wake when the first birdsong began, when the sky was just beginning to lighten. In the deep winter, he would wake in the cold darkness, well before dawn. Now, in November, he woke somewhere in between. The darkness was beginning to thin, ever so slightly, though the sun was still perhaps an hour from rising. He lay still for several minutes, as he did every morning, allowing consciousness to fully return, feeling the transition from sleep to waking. This was not an unpleasant time. His bed, while simple, was comfortable enough after so many years. The mattress was a large sack stuffed with straw, which he replaced twice a year when the old straw became too compressed and uncomfortable. He had 2 woolen blankets, both woven by Margaret years ago, before the fever took her. The blankets were heavy and warm, and they still carried, in Thomas's imagination at least, a faint scent of the lavender that Margaret used to tuck between the folds when she stored them during summer months. The air in the sleeping loft was cold, though not bitterly so. November in Norwich was often damp and chilly, but rarely freezing. Still, the air had that particular quality of autumn cold, the kind that made you reluctant to leave the warmth of your bed, knowing that the world outside the blankets would be uncomfortable until you got moving and your blood began to flow. Thomas could hear the wind outside, moving through the thatch of his roof with a soft rustling sound. He heard a dog barking somewhere in the distance, perhaps 3 or 4 streets away. The sound carried clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. He heard the creak of timber in the workshop below as the building settled. These were all familiar sounds, the acoustic texture of his life. Slowly he pushed back the blankets. The cold air touched his skin immediately, raising small bumps along his arms. He wore only a long linen undershirt for sleeping, and now the fabric felt thin and insufficient. He sat up, taking care with the movement. His lower back always ached in the mornings, a deep, persistent pain that had been with him for several years now. Moving too quickly only made it worse. He sat on the edge of his mattress for a moment, gathering himself. His feet found his simple leather shoes, which he had left beside the bed. The leather was worn soft, molded to the shape of his feet after years of wear. He slipped them on, feeling the familiar comfort of them. Standing slowly, Thomas moved to the corner of the loft, where his clothes hung on wooden pegs driven into the wall. He removed his sleeping shirt and stood for a moment in the cold air, feeling it against his bare skin. His body was lean and wiry, with little fat to insulate him. The muscles of his arms and shoulders were well defined from years of physical labor, but his skin hung loose in places, a sign of age creeping forward. He pulled on his linen undertunic first, then his woolen hose, rolling them up over his calves and thighs and tying them to his brace, the simple linen undergarment that served as medieval underwear. Then came his outer tunic, a simple garment of undyed brown wool that fell to mid-thigh. The wool was soft from countless washings, and there were patches at both elbows where Margaret had mended worn spots years ago. The stitching was neat and careful, and Thomas felt a small pang each time he saw it. Remembering her sitting by the fire with needle and thread, her face concentrated on her work. He wrapped a leather belt around his waist, pulling it tight and fastening the buckle. From the belt hung a small sheath containing a simple knife, a tool as essential as his hands for the work he did. He wrapped linen strips around his lower legs for extra warmth, then tied them in place. Finally, he pulled on his outer shoes over his inner ones, an extra layer against the cold ground of his workshop floor. Now dressed, Thomas moved to the ladder that led down to the main floor of his workshop. The ladder was simple, just 2 long poles, with rungs lashed between them, but it was sturdy and familiar. He climbed down carefully, feeling each rung under his feet before committing his weight to it. His hands gripped the sides of the ladder, rough wood worn smooth by years of daily use. The workshop floor was packed earth, hard and level from decades of foot traffic. It was noticeably colder down here than in the sleeping loft, where heat rose and gathered. Thomas's breath formed small clouds in the air as he moved toward the hearth. The hearth was built into the corner of the workshop, a structure of stone and clay that rose to a height of about 3 feet. A chimney of wattle and daub, plastered inside with clay to make it somewhat fire-resistant, carried smoke up through the roof. The hearth was the heart of Thomas's work. Here he would heat the tallow for rendering, keep his dipping pot warm, and heat water for various purposes. It also provided the only real warmth in the workshop during cold months. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, the hearth contained only ash and a few dormant embers from the previous evening's fire. Thomas had banked the fire the night before, covering the coals with ash to keep them alive through the night. With luck, some embers would still be alive, making the morning fire easier to start. Thomas knelt before the hearth. His knees protested the movement, a sharp complaint from joints that had absorbed too many years of kneeling and kneeling again. He ignored the discomfort, as he had learned to ignore many small pains over the years. They were simply part of living, part of having a body that worked and aged. He carefully brushed aside some of the ash with his hand, revealing the area where he had left the coals the night before. There, in the grey ash, he saw a faint red glow. Relief touched him. though he barely registered the feeling. Alive embers meant the fire would start more easily. Dead embers meant he would need to strike sparks with flint and steel, a process that could take many frustrating minutes on a cold, damp morning. Thomas leaned forward, pursing his lips, and blew gently on the embers. His breath, warm from his body, touched the hidden heat. The red glow brightened slightly. He blew again, a slow, steady stream of air. The glow grew brighter, spreading. A thin tendril of smoke began to rise. From a basket beside the hearth, Thomas took a handful of dried moss that he had gathered and prepared for this purpose. Moss was excellent tinder, catching fire easily and burning long enough to ignite larger materials. He laid the moss carefully over the glowing embers and blew on it again. The moss began to smoke. Then suddenly, almost magically, a tiny flame appeared. It was a small victory, as it was every morning, this coaxing of fire from sleeping embers. Thomas added more moss, then small twigs, each no thicker than a goose quill, arranged carefully to allow air to flow between them. The flames grew, crackling softly as they consumed the dry wood. The sound was pleasant, companionable in the silent workshop. The light from the flames pushed back the darkness just a little, creating a small sphere of illumination around the hearth. Now Thomas added slightly larger pieces of wood, each carefully selected from his woodpile. Good firewood was essential for his work, and Thomas had learned long ago to be particular about it. He preferred oak and ash, woods that burned hot and steady with little smoke. He had purchased a cartload of wood the previous autumn from a woodcutter who lived in the forest outside town. Thomas had split the logs himself with a wedge and more, cutting them into pieces of various sizes. The wood had seasoned under a shed behind his workshop, protected from rain but open to air, drying slowly until it was perfect for burning. The fire grew steadily. Thomas sat back on his heels, watching the flames as they moved and shifted, never still, always consuming. There was something hypnotic about fire, something that captured the attention in a way that few other things did. Thomas had spent countless hours over his lifetime watching flames, and he never tired of it. As the fire established itself, Thomas stood slowly, his knees cracking as he straightened. He moved to the large water barrel that stood near the door. This barrel was kept filled with water carried from the town well, a communal well 2 streets away where townspeople gathered to draw water and exchange news. Thomas had filled the barrel 2 days ago, and it was still more than half full. He dipped a wooden bucket into the barrel, feeling the resistance of the water, the weight of it as he lifted the bucket out. He carried the bucket to the hearth and poured water into an iron pot, filling it about halfway. This pot he hung on one of the iron hooks that extended from a swinging arm built into the hearth structure. The pot hung over the fire now, and the water would heat slowly, providing warm water for washing and for his morning meal. The workshop was beginning to lighten, almost imperceptibly. Not from the sun yet, but from the general lightening of the sky as dawn approached. Through the oiled linen windows, Thomas could see that the deep black of night had given way to a dark grey. In perhaps another hour, the sun would rise, though on this November day it would be a weak, pale sun struggling through clouds. Thomas walked to his workbench, which stood beneath the larger of his 2 windows. The bench was a simple but sturdy construction of thick oak planks, scarred and stained from years of use. On shelves above and below the bench, Thomas kept his tools and materials. Everything had its place, a organization born from long habit. He knew where every tool was, could reach for anything in the darkness if needed. On the bench now, arranged in neat rows, stood the candles he had made the previous day. Perhaps 60 or 70 of them, each roughly the same size, about as thick as a man's thumb, and perhaps 8 inches long. They were pale, the color of cream, with a slightly waxy surface. These were tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat. They would burn with a smoky yellow flame and a distinctive smell, but they would burn steadily and provide light, which was what mattered. Thomas ran his fingers along the candles, a habitual inspection. His touch was light, barely a brush against the waxy surface. He was checking for imperfections, though he rarely found any. After so many years of making candles, his process had become reliable. But still he checked, because this was part of his routine, and routine was important. Routine gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together into meaninglessness. The candles felt slightly cool to his touch. They had hardened overnight, as tallow does. Tomorrow, he would deliver them to his regular customers. The sexton at St. Peter's Church would take 20. A merchant on Elm Hill who liked to work by candlelight in the evenings would take a dozen. The wife of a wool trader would take 10 for her household. The rest would go to the marketplace, where Thomas had an arrangement with a woman who sold various household goods from a stall. She would sell his candles for him, taking a small portion of the price for herself. This was Thomas's life. Making candles. Selling candles. The rhythm of production and sale. Repeated endlessly. Some might find it monotonous. And perhaps it was. But Thomas had long ago made his peace with monotony. There was comfort in it, in knowing what each day would bring. Surprises were rarely pleasant, in his experience. Better the familiar routine, the known quantity of his days. The water in the pot over the fire had begun to steam gently. Morning was progressing. The day's work awaited. Thomas turned from his workbench and began to prepare for what lay ahead. The fire had settled into a good, steady burn. The flames had died down from their initial bright crackling to a deeper glow, with small flames licking around the larger pieces of wood. This was exactly what Thomas wanted. A fire that would burn hot and long without needing constant attention. A fire that would provide steady heat for the work ahead. Outside, the town was beginning to wake. Thomas could hear the occasional sounds now. A door opening somewhere. The murmur of voices in the distance. The crow of a rooster announcing dawn, though the sun had not yet appeared. These sounds were comforting in their familiarity. Every morning brought the same gradual awakening of the community. The same pattern of life resuming. Thomas moved to the corner of his workshop where he kept his storage area. This was the coolest part of the building, deliberately so. The corner was partially below ground level, dug down perhaps 2 feet, creating a small cellar-like space. Here, the earth itself provided cooling, maintaining a temperature cooler than the rest of the workshop even in summer. In winter, it was cold enough that Thomas could store fresh provisions for several days without spoilage. Wooden barrels and ceramic crocks stood in this storage area. One barrel contained flour, another held dried peas and beans. There were smaller crocks with salt, dried herbs, a small amount of honey that Thomas had purchased at great expense the previous summer. And there were 3 barrels that contained the raw material of Thomas's craft, animal fat, purchased from butchers around the town. Thomas had a regular arrangement with several butchers. When they slaughtered cattle, sheep, or pigs, they saved the fat for him. Some of this fat they rendered themselves into tallow and sold at a higher price to chandlers who made the finest candles. But much of it they sold raw to Thomas, who was willing to do the labor of rendering himself in exchange for a lower price. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that had existed for years. 3 days ago, Thomas had visited John the butcher, a man he had known for 20 years. John's shop was 2 streets away, close enough that Thomas could smell it on days when the wind blew from that direction. The smell of a butcher's shop was distinctive. The metallic scent of blood, the smell of raw flesh, the acrid odor of offal and waste. It was not pleasant, but it was a necessary smell, part of the functioning of the town. Everyone ate meat, so everyone tolerated the butcher's necessary work. John had had a good week. He had slaughtered 2 cattle and several sheep for various customers. He had saved the fat for Thomas, packing it into a large wooden bucket. The fat had cost Thomas 4 pence, a significant expense but necessary. From this fat, Thomas would make enough candles to sell for perhaps 8 or 9 pence, leaving him a profit of 4 or 5 pence after the cost of wicks, his time, and the firewood. It was not a fortune, but it was a living, the same living he had made for 20 years. Now Thomas bent down and lifted one of the barrels containing the raw fat. He had to be careful with this movement. His back, always troublesome in the mornings, was particularly vulnerable to strain when lifting heavy objects. He kept his back straight and lifted with his legs, as he had learned to do over the years. Even so, he felt a deep ache in his lower spine as he raised the barrel. The pain was sharp enough to make him pause for a moment, breathing slowly, waiting for it to subside to its usual dull throb. He carried the barrel to his workbench, moving slowly and deliberately. The barrel was heavy, perhaps 30 pounds, and Thomas was conscious of every step, every slight shift of weight. He set it down on the bench with relief, flexing his hands to restore circulation to his fingers. The fat inside the barrel was yellowish-white, with a waxy texture. It was not uniform. There were chunks of various sizes, some pure fat, others containing bits of membrane, tissue, and occasionally small pieces of meat that the butcher had not completely trimmed away. It looked unprepossessing, almost unpleasant. But Thomas saw it for what it was: potential. This raw material would be transformed, through his labor and skill, into something useful and valuable. He took a large wooden bowl from the shelf beneath his workbench and began transferring chunks of the raw fat from the barrel to the bowl. His hands sank into the fat, cold and slightly slippery. The feel of it was familiar, something he had felt thousands of times before. His fingers sorted through the chunks, selecting pieces of similar size. He filled the bowl about halfway, then returned the barrel to its place in the cool storage area. Back at his workbench, Thomas sat on his work stool, a simple seat of wood without a back, worn smooth by decades of use. The stool was the perfect height for his bench, positioned so that he could work comfortably without hunching over. This was important. Good posture saved his back over the long hours of work. He took a wide-bladed knife from its place on the bench. This knife was a tool he used specifically for this purpose, for cutting fat into smaller pieces. The blade was about 6 inches long, made of iron that Thomas had to sharpen regularly using a whetstone. He kept the knife sharp. A sharp knife made the work easier and safer, cutting cleanly rather than requiring the force that might cause the blade to slip. Thomas began cutting the fat into smaller chunks, each about the size of a walnut. This was necessary for the rendering process. Smaller pieces would melt more evenly and completely, releasing their oils more efficiently. Larger chunks would take too long and might not render completely, wasting material. The work had a rhythm to it. Thomas would pick up a chunk of fat, place it on the cutting board built into his workbench, cut it into smaller pieces, and then brush those pieces into another bowl beside him. Pick up, place, cut, brush aside. Pick up, place, cut, brush aside. His hands moved with the easy efficiency of long practice. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The knife made a soft sound as it cut through the fat, a slight squelching, slicing sound. The fat offered little resistance to the sharp blade. Sometimes Thomas encountered a piece with more membrane or gristle, and then the knife would require more pressure, more sawing motion. But mostly the cutting was smooth and rhythmic. As he worked, the light outside continued to grow. The darkness had given way to grey, and now the grey was slowly lightening towards something that might eventually be called daylight, though the heavy clouds promised that today's sun would be wan and weak. Through his window, Thomas could see across the narrow street to the buildings opposite. He could see smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as other people started their morning fires. He could see a woman opening shutters on an upper floor, her face appearing briefly in the window before she withdrew back inside. The street itself was still quiet, but that would change soon. By mid-morning, there would be traffic, carts bringing goods to market, people going about their business, children running and playing, dogs wandering in search of scraps. For now, though, the street was peaceful, and Thomas appreciated this quiet time of day. He had always been a man who valued quiet, who found noise and bustle tiresome. The early morning, with its stillness and calm, suited him perfectly. He continued cutting. The pile of small pieces grew steadily in the bowl beside him. His hands moved automatically, requiring no conscious thought. This freed his mind to wander, and wander it did, though not far. Thomas was not given to elaborate fantasies or deep philosophical musings. His thoughts moved through ordinary channels. What work needed to be done today? Whether he should make the delivery to the church tomorrow or wait until the day after. Whether his supply of wicks was sufficient, or whether he should visit the hemp seller to purchase more thread for twisting into new wicks. Sometimes his thoughts touched on the past. He thought of Margaret occasionally, not with the sharp grief that had consumed him in the months after her death, but with a gentler melancholy. He remembered small things, the way she hummed while she worked, the particular grace of her hands as she wove at her loom, the warmth of her presence in the workshop. She had been a good companion, and her absence was still felt, even after 7 years. The workshop was quieter without her, emptier, but Thomas had adjusted, as people do. Life continued, whether one wanted it to or not, and the work still needed to be done. After perhaps an hour of steady cutting, Thomas had processed enough fat for the morning's work. The bowl beside him was full of small pieces, perhaps 8 or 9 pounds total. This would be enough for one batch of rendering, which would give him enough tallow for a good number of candle. He set aside the knife and stood, stretching carefully. His back had stiffened from sitting on the stool, and he felt the familiar ache settling deep into his spine. He bent forward gently, feeling the stretch in his lower back, then straightened slowly. The ache lessened slightly, but did not disappear. It never really disappeared anymore. From a hook on the wall, Thomas took down his rendering pot. This was a large iron pot, blackened with age and use, with a rounded bottom and 2 iron handles on the sides. It was heavy even when empty. Iron was heavy, and this pot was thick enough to withstand daily use over fire. Thomas had owned this pot for nearly 15 years. Before that, he had used a similar pot that had belonged to his father, who had also been a chandler. That pot had eventually cracked from decades of heating and cooling, and Thomas had been forced to purchase a new one, an expense that had taken him months to afford. He carried the pot to his workbench and began transferring the cut pieces of fat into it, using his hands to scoop them from the bowl. The fat was cold from sitting, and his hands quickly became coated with a thin layer of the waxy substance. He worked patiently until all the cut pieces were in the pot, filling it perhaps a third of the way. The pot could hold more, but Thomas had learned through experience that it was better to render smaller batches. The fat melted more evenly, was easier to stir, and was less likely to burn. To the bottom of the pot, Thomas added a small amount of water, perhaps a cupful. This was a technique his father had taught him, and his father had learned it from his father before him. The water would prevent the fat from sticking to the bottom of the pot in the early stages of rendering, when the pieces had not yet released enough liquid tallow to coat the bottom. Later, as the temperature rose, the water would evaporate, leaving only the pure rendered tallow. It was a small detail, but one that made a difference in the quality of the final product. Thomas carried the heavy pot to the hearth. The fire had burned down somewhat, but the bed of coals was deep and glowing with heat. This was perfect for the slow work of rendering tallow. Too much flame would heat the pot too quickly, risking burning the fat. A bed of coals provides steady, even heat that could be maintained for hours. The hearth had an iron framework built into it, a structure that allowed pots and pans to be suspended over the fire at various heights. Thomas chose one of the stronger hooks, knowing the pot full of fat would be heavy, and carefully hooked the pot's handle onto it. The pot now hung perhaps 8 inches above the bed of coals, positioned to receive steady heat, but not so close as to overheat. Thomas stood back and looked at his work. The pot hung steadily. The fire glowed beneath it. Everything was ready. Now came the waiting. The slow process of rendering that could not be hurried. But while he waited, there were other tasks to attend to. A chandler's work was rarely entirely focused on one task. There were always small jobs to be done, preparations to be made, maintenance to be performed. Thomas turned his attention to these tasks, knowing that he would need to return to stir the rendering fat every 10 or 15 minutes, but that between these stirrings he could be productive in other ways. First, though, he walked to the hearth and checked the pot of water he had set to warm earlier. The water was now quite hot, steaming gently. Thomas used a folded cloth to protect his hand and lifted the pot off its hook. He carried it to a wooden stand near his workbench, where he kept a large basin. He poured some of the hot water into the basin, then added cold water from his barrel until the temperature was comfortable. Then he rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands, scrubbing away the layer of fat that coated them. The hot water melted the fat, and Thomas used a small piece of soap, a precious luxury, to clean his hands thoroughly. The soap was rough, made from rendered fat and lye, harsh on the skin but effective. He dried his hands on a cloth and felt considerably better. Clean hands were important, not just for comfort, but for the work itself. Fat-coated hands would make it difficult to handle the other tasks he needed to complete. The day had fully arrived now. Outside, the street had come to life. Thomas could hear voices, the sound of carts, the bustle of people going about their business. The weak November sun had finally risen, though it provided more light than warmth, filtered as it was through thick clouds. Still, the workshop was brighter now, and Thomas could see more clearly without needing to rely on firelight. He walked to the pot of rendering fat and gave it a stir with a long wooden paddle. The fat had begun to soften at the edges, the pieces touching the hot sides of the pot glistening with moisture. Small droplets of liquid were forming at the bottom. It was beginning. The transformation from solid chunks to liquid tallow had started. It would be hours yet before the process was complete. But it had begun, and that was what mattered. The rendering of tallow was a process that could not be rushed. It required heat, time, and patience. Thomas had learned this lesson early in his apprenticeship, back when he was a boy of 12 learning the craft under his father's watchful eye. He had tried once, eager and impatient as young people are, to speed the process by building up the fire too hot. The result had been acrid smoke, burned fat, and a batch of ruined tallow that his father had made him dispose of himself. The lesson had stuck. Some things simply took the time they took, and fighting against that reality only led to waste and frustration. Now, with 4 decades of experience behind him, Thomas understood the rhythm of rendering. He knew without needing to think about it when to stir, when to adjust the fire, when to add more wood or let the coals burn down. His body held this knowledge as much as his mind did. He could almost sense when the pot needed attention, as if some part of him remained always aware of it, even when his conscious attention was elsewhere. Every 10 or 15 minutes, Thomas would walk to the hearth and stir the pot. Each time, he could see the progress. The chunks of fat grew smaller as they released their oils. The pool of liquid at the bottom of the pot grew larger. The color of the liquid changed gradually from cloudy white to a clearer, more golden hue. Small bubbles rose through the liquid, releasing steam and that distinctive smell of rendering fat. A thick, slightly sweet, slightly acrid odor that permeated the workshop and, indeed, all of Thomas's clothing and possessions. It was a smell he barely noticed anymore. To him, it was simply the smell of his work, as familiar as the smell of his own body. Between these periodic stirrings, Thomas occupied himself with a dozen small tasks that filled a chandler's day. These were tasks that needed to be done regularly. Tasks that kept his workshop functioning smoothly. Tasks that prepared for the next stage of work. First, he turned his attention to his supply of wicks. Candle wicks were essential, obviously. A candle without a wick was merely a lump of tallow. Thomas made his own wicks, as did most chandlers. The process was simple, but required attention to detail. A wick had to be the right thickness for the candle it would serve. Too thin, and it would burn too quickly, or might drown in the melted wax. Too thick, and the flame would be too large, producing excessive smoke and consuming the candle too rapidly. Thomas purchased his wick material from a rope maker named Simon, who had a workshop near the waterfront. Simon dealt in hemp and cotton, twisting them into ropes of various thicknesses for use on ships and in various trades. For Thomas, Simon would sell cotton thread, already twisted, but not yet into the thicker ropes. This thread was perfect for making candle wicks. Thomas had a supply of this cotton thread stored in a wooden box on the shelf above his workbench. He took down the box and opened it, revealing the neat coils of white cotton thread inside. The thread was slightly yellowed with age, but still strong and serviceable. He sat at his workbench with the box of thread and began the process of creating wicks. He would take several lengths of the thread and twist them together, creating a thicker strand. For the size of candles he was making today, he needed wicks made from 4 strands, twisted together. The twisting had to be tight and even, with no loose spots or variations in thickness. Thomas had a simple tool for this, a wooden device with a handle on one end and a hook on the other. He would tie the ends of 4 strands to the hook, then twist the handle. As the handle turned, the strands would wind around each other, creating a unified wick. When the twisting was tight enough, Thomas would remove the wick from the hook and tie off the end to prevent it from unraveling. This work was repetitive and required little thought, which suited Thomas fine. His hands moved through the motions automatically, while his mind wandered or rested or simply observed. The twisting of the handle made a soft rhythmic sound. The cotton thread was smooth under his fingers. The finished wicks piled up slowly beside him, each one about 2 feet long, enough to make a candle with a bit extra for handling during the dipping process. As he worked on the wicks, Thomas heard the sounds of the street outside growing louder. Mid-morning was approaching, and the town was fully awake now. He heard the call of vendors in the marketplace, men and women selling their goods, calling out to attract customers. He heard the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the clop of horse hooves, the bark of dogs, the cry of children playing some game. These sounds formed a constant background, the acoustic texture of daily life in a medieval town. Occasionally, someone would pass directly in front of Thomas's workshop. He would catch glimpses through his window. A woman carrying a basket, a man leading a donkey, 2 children running. Sometimes people would glance toward his workshop as they passed. Some might nod in recognition if they knew him. Most would simply pass by, intent on their own business. Thomas was not a particularly notable or memorable member of the community. He was simply one craftsman among many, doing honest work, causing no trouble, living a quiet life. After making perhaps 30 wicks, Thomas set the twisting device aside and stood to stretch. His shoulders were stiff from the repetitive motion, and he rolled them carefully, feeling the muscles protest and then gradually loosen. He walked to the rendering pot and gave it another stir. The transformation was well underway now. Perhaps an hour had passed since he had put the pot on the fire, and the chunks of fat had shrunk considerably. Most of the solid material had melted, releasing its oils into the growing pool of liquid tallow. What remained solid was significantly smaller, the denser bits of membrane and tissue that would never fully melt. These were the cracklings, and they would need to be strained out later. The liquid itself had clarified considerably, losing its cloudy appearance and taking on a more translucent quality, a pale golden color that caught the light from the fire beneath it. The smell of rendering fat had grown stronger as the process continued. It filled the workshop completely now, thick and pervasive. To someone not accustomed to it, the smell might be unpleasant, even offensive. But to Thomas, it was simply the smell of progress, of work being done, of raw material being transformed into something useful. He adjusted the fire slightly, using an iron poker to redistribute the coals, ensuring even heat beneath the pot. This was important. Uneven heating could cause the tallow to scorch in one area while remaining insufficiently heated in another. Thomas had learned through experience to read the fire, to understand how the coals needed to be arranged for different purposes. It was knowledge that came from years of daily practice, knowledge that lived in his hands and his eyes more than in his conscious mind. With the fire adjusted and the pot stirred, Thomas returned to his workbench and turned his attention to another preparatory task, cleaning and checking his candle molds. Thomas used two methods for making candles. The simpler and more common method was dipping, repeatedly dipping a wick into liquid tallow, allowing each layer to cool and harden before dipping again. This was the method he would use today for most of his candles. But he also had molds, metal tubes of various sizes that could be used to make candles of a more uniform shape and size. Molded candles commanded a slightly higher price because of their more elegant appearance. The molds were stored on a shelf, and Thomas took them down one by one. There were 6 of them, each a simple iron tube, open at both ends, about 8 inches long and perhaps 3/4 of an inch in diameter. To use them, Thomas would thread a wick through the center of each tube, securing it at both ends, then pour molten tallow into the tube from the top. When the tallow cooled and hardened, he would slide the finished candle out of the mold. The molds needed to be clean for each use. Any residue from previous candles could create imperfections in new candles. Thomas examined each mold carefully, looking for any bits of remaining tallow clinging to the inside. He had a thin, flexible piece of leather that he threaded through each mold, pulling it back and forth to clean the interior. This was finicky work, requiring good light and careful attention. He held each mold up to the window, peering through it to check that it was truly clean. As he worked on the molds, checking and cleaning each one, Thomas's thoughts drifted as they often did during repetitive tasks. He thought about the coming winter, which would be his busiest season. As the days grew shorter and darkness came earlier, the demand for candles would increase. People needed light for their homes and workshops, for their evening work and activities. Thomas would need to maintain a good supply, which meant long days of rendering and dipping, of production and delivery. He thought about his finances, a topic that was never far from his mind. He was not poor, not by the standards of medieval Norwich. He earned enough to feed himself adequately, to keep his workshop in reasonable repair, to purchase the materials he needed for his craft. He even managed to save a small amount each year, coins that he kept hidden in a hollow space he had created in one of the wooden beams of his workshop. These savings were his security against illness or injury, against hard times that might come. But he was not wealthy. He lived simply, ate simply, dressed simply. There was no money for luxuries, for indulgences. His life was defined by its functionality, by the need to work and to survive, and to continue working. He thought sometimes about what his life might have been if Margaret had lived. Perhaps they would have had children, and those children would be adults now, learning the trade or married with children of their own. Perhaps he would be a grandfather by now, passing his knowledge on to a new generation. Instead, he was alone. And when he died, there would be no one to take over his workshop, no one to continue the work he had spent his life perfecting. The workshop would be sold, probably, or rented to some other craftsman who would adapt it to their own needs. These thoughts were not particularly sad or bitter. They were simply observations, acknowledgements of reality. Thomas had learned not to dwell on what might have been. Such dwelling served no purpose. It changed nothing. Better to focus on what was, on the present moment, on the work at hand. He finished cleaning the last mold and set it aside with the others. All 6 molds were now clean and ready for use, though he was not certain he would use them today. It depended on how much rendered tallow he had, on how the dipping process went, on a dozen small factors that he would assess as the day progressed. Thomas stood and stretched again, a regular necessity given the hours of bending and sitting that his work required. He walked to the hearth once more and stirred the rendering pot. The fat had now almost completely liquefied. Only small bits of crackling remained, floating in the golden liquid. The rendering was nearly complete. Soon it would be time to strain the liquid, separating the pure tallow from the unwanted bits of tissue and membrane. But not quite yet. The liquid needed to continue heating for a while longer, needed to bubble gently to ensure that all the moisture had evaporated from it. Water in the tallow would cause problems later. It would make the candles burn poorly, might even cause them to sputter and smoke. Thomas knew to be patient, to let the process complete fully rather than rushing to the next step. He checked the fire. It had burned down somewhat, and he added 2 more pieces of wood to the coals. The wood caught quickly, flames licking up around the fresh fuel. The additional heat would help ensure that any remaining moisture in the tallow evaporated completely. Thomas walked to his door and stood in the opening, looking out at the street. The November day was grey and cool, but not unpleasant. The weak sun provided some light, at least, though little warmth. People moved about their business, going here and there, each absorbed in their own concerns. Thomas recognized many of them. The baker's apprentice hurrying past with a basket of loaves, the blacksmith standing in the doorway of his shop a few buildings down. The widow Eleanor, who lived across the street and supported herself by taking in mending. Eleanor saw Thomas standing in his doorway and raised a hand in greeting. Thomas nodded in return. They were not close, not friends exactly, but they were neighbors and had been for years. Sometimes they exchanged a few words about the weather or town news. Sometimes they simply acknowledged each other's presence with a nod or a gesture. It was the kind of minimal but genuine human connection that characterized much of Thomas's social life. A cart rumbled past, loaded with something covered by canvas. The driver, a young man Thomas didn't recognize, called out to his horse, urging it forward. The horse plodded along, patient and steady, its breath forming clouds in the cool air. Thomas stood in his doorway for a few minutes, simply observing, being present to the life of the street. Then he turned back to his workshop. The rendering would be ready for straining soon. The afternoon's work, the actual making of candles, lay ahead. After nearly 3 hours of gentle heating, the tallow was finally ready for straining. Thomas could tell by the appearance of the liquid, clear and golden, with only the small dark bits of crackling floating in it, and by the smell, which had changed from the initial thick sweetness to something cleaner, more refined. This next step was critical and required care. The straining process would separate the pure liquid tallow from all the impurities, leaving Thomas with the clean material he needed for making candles. If done carelessly, if the straining cloth tore, or if he spilled the hot liquid, Hours of work would be wasted. Thomas had a wooden frame specifically built for this purpose. The frame was about 2 feet square, with a piece of loosely woven linen cloth stretched across it and tied securely at the corners. The cloth had to be woven loosely enough to allow the liquid to pass through, but tightly enough to catch the small bits of crackling and any other solid impurities. Over the years, Thomas had gone through many such cloths, wearing them out through repeated use, replacing them with new ones when they became too thin or developed holes. He positioned the straining frame over a large ceramic crock that he used specifically for collecting strained tallow. The crock was heavy and wide, capable of holding several gallons of liquid. It was glazed inside, making it easy to clean. And it had a wide mouth that accommodated the straining frame perfectly. Now came the delicate part. Thomas needed to lift the heavy iron pot full of hot liquid tallow and pour it through the straining cloth. The pot was hot, the liquid was hot, and both pot and liquid were heavy. This was the sort of task where accidents could happen, where a moment of carelessness or a slip could result in serious burns. Thomas took 2 thick cloths that he kept specifically for handling hot pots. He wrapped one cloth around each hand, creating a barrier between his skin and the hot iron. Then, moving carefully, he reached for the pot's handles. He could feel the heat even through the thick cloth. He gripped firmly, aware that a weak grip could cause the pot to slip. Slowly, with great care, Thomas lifted the pot off its hook. The weight was considerable. The pot itself was heavy, and it was nearly full of liquid. Thomas felt the strain in his arms and shoulders, felt his back protest the weight. He held the pot steady for a moment, ensuring his grip was secure, that he had his balance. Then he began to move, taking small, careful steps toward the straining frame. 3 steps, 4. His entire focus was on keeping the pot steady, on not stumbling, on not making any sudden movements that might cause the hot liquid to slosh. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the workshop. He reached the straining frame. Now came the actual pouring. Thomas tilted the pot slowly, watching as the golden liquid began to flow from the lip of the pot. The stream caught the light, looking almost beautiful as it arced through the air and struck the straining cloth. The cloth sagged under the weight of the liquid, but it held. The tallow began to filter through, dripping into the crock below. Thomas could see the small dark bits of crackling being caught by the cloth, held back while the clean liquid passed through. He poured slowly, steadily, not rushing. If he poured too fast, the liquid might overflow the straining cloth or cause it to tear. If he tilted the pot too much, he might lose control of the pour. Slow and steady was the key, as it was with so much of his work. The pot gradually lightened as its contents transferred to the crock. Thomas's arms ached from holding the heavy weight extended, but he maintained his grip, maintained his focus. The stream of golden liquid continued to flow, mesmerizing in its steady movement. After what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or two, the flow slowed to a trickle, then to individual drops. Thomas tilted the pot further, ensuring every bit of liquid was poured out. The last few drops fell, caught by the straining cloth, filtered through to join the rest. Thomas set the heavy pot down on the floor, carefully placing it where it would not be in his way. He flexed his hands, feeling the relief as the strain left his muscles. His palms ached from gripping the handles so tightly, and his forearms trembled slightly from the sustained effort. But the task was complete. The tallow was strained. Thomas looked at the crock and felt a small satisfaction. The liquid inside was clear and golden, beautiful in its purity. This was good tallow, clean and properly rendered. It would make good candles. The straining cloth now held a small amount of cracklings, the bits of tissue and membrane that had not melted. These were not wasted. Cracklings had their uses. They could be eaten, actually, though Thomas found them rather unpalatable. Some people enjoyed them, considering them a treat. Thomas usually took his cracklings to a neighbor who kept pigs. The pigs would eat anything, and they seemed to particularly enjoy cracklings. Thomas carefully removed the straining frame from atop the crock and set it aside. Later, he would scrape the cracklings into a small bowl for his neighbor. For now, though, he turned his attention to the crock of tallow. The tallow needed to cool, but not too much. It needed to reach the right temperature for dipping candles. Too hot, and the tallow would simply slide off the wick. Too cool, and it would not coat the wick evenly. Thomas had learned through long experience to judge this temperature by eye and by feel, but it would take time for the tallow to cool from its current temperature to the proper temperature. This cooling period was a natural break in Thomas's workday. The morning's heavy labor was complete. The afternoon's work had not yet begun. It was approaching midday, and Thomas realized he was hungry. The simple bowl of pottage he had eaten early that morning before dawn was long since digested. Thomas went to his small supply of food. He had a loaf of bread, dark and dense, that he had purchased from the baker 3 days ago. It was beginning to harden, but it was still edible. He cut several thick slices, using the same knife he had used earlier to cut the fat. He wiped the knife on a cloth first, removing any traces of fat that might remain. He had a small piece of cheese, hard and yellow, which he cut into thin slices to lay on the bread. There was half an onion wrapped in a cloth, and he cut this into pieces to eat with the bread and cheese. These simple foods, bread, cheese, onion, made up the bulk of Thomas's diet. Sometimes he had pottage, a thick soup made from peas or beans, which would cook slowly in a pot over his fire. Sometimes he had salted fish or preserved meat. But mostly he ate bread and cheese and whatever vegetables he could afford. He filled a wooden cup with water from his barrel and sat on the bench near his workbench to eat. The meal was simple and plain, but it was sufficient. Thomas ate slowly without particular attention to the food. It was fuel, sustenance for the afternoon's work. As he ate, he looked around his workshop. The space was familiar to him as his own body. He knew every beam, every nail, every tool. He knew which floorboards creaked when stepped upon, which corner was coldest in winter, where the best light fell during different times of day. This space had been his world for more than 20 years, ever since he had taken it over from his father when the old man became too frail to work. His father had been a chandler before him, and his father's father before that. The trade had passed down through generations, along with this workshop and its tools and its regular customers. When Thomas died, though, there would be no one to pass it to, no son to teach, no daughter's husband to train. The line would end with him. This thought came to Thomas occasionally, as it did now, but it did not trouble him greatly. He had accepted it long ago. Life was what it was. One did what one could, and when death came, one's work ended. Whether that work continued through others or ended completely, that was beyond one's control. He finished his meal and drank the last of his water. The bread sat heavy in his stomach, satisfying and solid. He stood and stretched, feeling the familiar aches in his back and shoulders. The brief rest had been good. He felt ready to continue. Outside, he could hear the church bells ringing for sext, the midday prayer. The sound carried across the town, marking the middle of the day. Thomas was not particularly religious, though he attended Mass on Sundays as everyone did. The church was simply part of life, its rhythms and rituals woven into the fabric of daily existence. The bells marked the hours, the feast days structured the year. The priest performed the necessary ceremonies of birth, marriage, and death. It was simply how things were. Thomas walked to the crock and checked the tallow. It had cooled somewhat, but it was still too hot. He would need to wait perhaps another half hour before it reached the right temperature. In the meantime, there were always small tasks to attend to. He took a broom made of bound twigs and began to sweep his workshop floor. The floor was packed earth, impossible to keep perfectly clean, but Thomas made the effort anyway. He swept up bits of straw and dust, small scraps of dried tallow, general debris that accumulated from daily work and living. The rhythmic motion of sweeping was soothing, meditative. The soft scratch of the bristles against the earth floor was a pleasant sound. As he swept, dust motes rose into the air, visible in the thin beams of light that came through his windows. They danced and swirled, tiny particles suspended in the air, catching the light. Thomas watched them for a moment, then continued sweeping. The afternoon lay ahead. Soon the tallow would be ready. Soon he would begin the main work of the day. The dipping of candles, the patient building up of layers, the transformation of simple wicks into functional lights. This was the work he knew best, the work he had done thousands upon thousands of times. And he would do it again today, as he did every day, as he would continue to do until age or illness or death stopped him. For now, though, he swept his floor and waited for the tallow to cool, and the midday sun, weak though it was, moved slowly across the grey November sky. By early afternoon, the tallow had cooled to the perfect temperature. Thomas knew this not through any thermometer. Such instruments were unknown to him. But through long experience, he dipped a finger into the liquid and held it there for a moment. The tallow was warm, but not hot, thick, but still liquid, ready to coat a wick and harden into a smooth layer. This was the temperature he needed. Now began the work that would occupy the remainder of his day, the work that was at the heart of his craft, the dipping of candles. This was methodical work, repetitive work, work that followed a rhythm as old as the trade itself. It required patience and attention, but not intense concentration. One's hands learned the movements and could perform them, while one's mind wandered or rested, or simply observed the passage of time. Thomas had several wooden racks, specifically designed for candle dipping. Each rack was a simple construction. 2 vertical posts, connected by several horizontal bars, each bar capable of holding multiple wicks. The racks stood about 5 feet tall, and when hung with wicks, they looked almost like primitive looms. He had 4 such racks, and he had positioned them around his workshop in a rough circle, each one far enough from the others that the hanging candles would not touch as they grew thicker with each dipping. This circular arrangement allowed Thomas to move in a continuous loop, dipping one rack, hanging it to dry, moving to the next rack for its dipping. And by the time he returned to the first rack, the candles would be cool enough for another layer. First, though, Thomas needed to prepare the wicks. He took the wicks he had made earlier that morning, 30 of them, each about 2 feet long. To each wick, he tied a small weight at the bottom. These weights were tiny pieces of lead, each no bigger than a pea. The lead served 2 purposes. First, it would help keep the wick straight as it hung, preventing it from curling or twisting. Second, it would provide the initial shape for the bottom of the candle, giving it a point from which the tallow could build up evenly. Tying the lead weights was finicky work. The knot had to be tight enough that the weight would not slip off during the dipping process, but not so tight that it deformed the wick. Thomas's fingers worked automatically, tying the same knot he had tied thousands of times before. Loop, pull through, tighten. Loop, pull through, tighten. One weight tied, then another, then another. When all 30 wicks had their weights attached, Thomas began tying them to the horizontal bars of his racks. He spaced them carefully, about 3 inches apart, ensuring they would have room to grow without touching each other. Each wick hung down from the bar, the lead weight pulling it straight, ready to receive its first coating of tallow. Thomas arranged 10 wicks on the first rack, 10 on the second, and 10 on the third. He had a 4th rack available if needed, but 30 candles would likely be sufficient for today's work. Any more would use up all his tallow, and he needed to keep some in reserve for unexpected orders or urgent needs. With the racks prepared, Thomas moved the crock of tallow to a position near his hearth, where it would stay warm without getting too hot. The tallow needed to maintain a consistent temperature throughout the dipping process. If it cooled too much, it would become too thick and would not coat the wicks evenly. Thomas had a small brazier, a shallow metal pan holding hot coals, which he positioned beneath the crock. The gentle heat from the coals would keep the tallow at the perfect temperature. Everything was ready. Thomas lifted the first rack, holding it by the 2 vertical posts. The 10 wicks hung down, swaying slightly with the movement. He carried the rack to the crock and slowly, carefully lowered the wicks into the tallow. The wicks submerged completely, disappearing into the golden liquid. Thomas held them there for just a moment, long enough for the tallow to completely coat the cotton fibers, but not so long that excess tallow would cling heavily. Then he lifted the rack slowly, raising it back out of the tallow. As the wicks emerged, they glistened with their coating of liquid tallow. Thin streams dripped from the bottom of each wick, falling back into the crock with small splashes. Thomas held the rack steady, allowing the excess to drip off. After a few seconds, the dripping slowed and stopped. Each wick now had a thin, translucent coating of tallow, barely visible but definitely present. Thomas carried the rack to the far side of his workshop and hung it on hooks he had installed in the wall specifically for this purpose. The wicks dangled, still and straight, their coating of tallow already beginning to cool and harden in the cool air of the workshop. He returned to the tallow crock and repeated the process with the second rack. Lift, carry to the crock, lower the wicks, hold them submerged for a moment, lift slowly, allow excess to drip, carry to the wall, hang the rack. The movements were smooth and practiced, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Then the third rack. Lift, carry, dip, lift, drip, carry, hang. By the time Thomas had dipped all 3 racks, the first rack had been hanging for perhaps 5 minutes. The tallow coating on those wicks had cooled and hardened. Thomas walked to the first rack and touched one of the wicks gently. Yes, it was hard now, no longer tacky. Ready for its second dip. And so the cycle began. Thomas lifted the first rack from its hanging position and carried it back to the crock. Down went the wicks, now slightly thicker than before, into the tallow. Hold, lift, drip, carry, hang. Move to the second rack, lift, carry, dip, lift, drip, carry, hang. Move to the third rack. Around and around Thomas moved, following this circular path through his workshop. Each time a rack returned to the tallow, its wicks were slightly thicker. The transformation was gradual but steady. After the first dipping, the wicks were barely changed, just slightly stiffened. After the third dipping, they were beginning to look like very thin candles. After the fifth, they had the recognizable shape of candles, though still quite small. After the 10th, they were proper tapers, though thinner than the final product would be. Thomas moved through this process in a sort of meditation. His body performed the actions: lift, carry, dip, lift, drip, carry, hang, while his mind existed in a state somewhere between thought and emptiness. He was aware of his surroundings, aware of his actions, but in a distant way, as if he were watching himself from a remove. The afternoon light shifted slowly across his workshop floor as the sun moved across the sky. The patch of light from his window crept along the packed earth, moving from one side of the room toward the other, marking the passage of time more reliably than any mechanical device. Outside, the sounds of the street changed as the day progressed. The busy activity of mid-morning gave way to the slightly calmer rhythm of afternoon. People were still about, but with less urgency. The marketplace would be winding down its busy morning trade. Craftsmen would be deep in their afternoon work. Children who had been running and playing earlier might now be helping with chores or sitting at lessons if they were fortunate enough to attend the church school. Thomas heard these sounds distantly. The occasional voice, the rumble of a cart, the bark of a dog. But they did not intrude on his focus. They were simply the background, the constant murmur of communal life that surrounded all individual work. As the dipping continued, Thomas occasionally needed to attend to small details. Sometimes a candle would begin to lean or curve as the layers built up unevenly. When he noticed this, Thomas would gently straighten it while the tallow was still slightly soft from the most recent dipping. His fingers would run along the length of the candle, smoothing it, encouraging it back to vertical. This required a delicate touch. Too much pressure would leave fingerprints in the surface or create a depression that would mar the candle's appearance. Sometimes excess tallow would build up at the bottom of a candle, creating a bulge or an uneven base. Thomas would trim this away with his knife, cutting carefully to maintain the candle's proper taper. The trimmings fell into a small bowl he kept for this purpose. Later, these scraps would be added back to his supply of tallow, melted down and reused. Nothing was wasted in Thomas's workshop. Tallow was too valuable, too labor-intensive to produce, to allow any of it to go to waste. As the candles grew thicker with each dipping, the process slowed slightly. Thicker candles required more time to cool between dippings. If Thomas dipped them too soon, while the previous layer was still soft, the new layer would partially melt the old one, creating an uneven, lumpy surface. Patience was essential. Thomas had to wait for each layer to fully harden before adding the next. To judge this, Thomas developed a feel for the timing. He learned to recognize the exact moment when a candle was ready for another dip. Sometimes he would touch one gently with a fingertip, testing the hardness. If the surface gave at all under his touch, it was not ready. If it felt completely hard and cool, it was time for another layer. The cycle continued: dip, hang, wait, dip, hang, wait. Around and around his workshop Thomas moved, following his circular path, building up layers of tallow on each wick, transforming simple cotton string into functional candles. After perhaps 15 dips per candle, they had reached a good thickness, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, which was standard for everyday tallow candles. They would burn for several hours, providing steady, if somewhat dim and smoky light. They were not beautiful objects, not like the fine beeswax candles that graced wealthy homes and important churches, but they were functional and affordable, which was what mattered for most people. But Thomas continued dipping. He wanted his candles to be slightly thicker than the minimum, slightly more substantial. This was partly a matter of pride. He took satisfaction in making a good product, and partly practical. Thicker candles burned longer, which meant customers would be more satisfied and more likely to return for more purchases. After 20 dips, the candles had reached their final size. Each one was about as thick as a man's thumb, smooth and even, with a pleasant taper from top to bottom. Thomas examined them carefully as they hung on their racks. His eye moved along each row, checking for any imperfections, any irregularities that might affect the burn quality or appearance. There were a few minor flaws. A small air bubble here, a slight roughness there, but nothing significant. These were good candles, made with care and skill. They would serve their purpose well. Thomas made a final round with all 3 racks, giving each candle one last dip. This final coating would be the outer surface, the part that people would see when they purchased the candles and when they burned them. Thomas wanted this layer to be especially smooth and even. He dipped each rack with particular care, making sure the tallow was at the perfect temperature, making sure each wick submerged completely and evenly, making sure the excess dripped off cleanly. When he hung the racks for this final time, he stood back and looked at his work with quiet satisfaction. 30 candles hung in his workshop, ready to harden overnight. Tomorrow they would be complete, ready to be trimmed and prepared for sale. This was good work, honest work, work that Thomas had done well for most of his life. The afternoon was fading now. Outside, the weak November sun was descending toward the horizon. The light through Thomas's window had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon, that particular color that comes just before evening. Shadows were growing longer. The day was drawing toward
As the late
afternoon
its close.
faded toward evening, but Thomas's work was not quite
through
finished.
the
final tasks
There
of
were
his
still
workday.
tasks to complete.
The candles
The final
hung throughout
steps
his
that would
workshop,
prepare
everything for tomorrow,
tomorrow.
hardening in the cool air, transforming from slightly soft and warm to completely hard and cool. By tomorrow morning they would be ready for the final preparations before sale. But for now, while they hardened, Thomas had other work to complete. The workshop needed to be cleaned and organized, tools needed to be put away, preparations needed to be made for tomorrow's work. This was the quiet denouement of the day, the winding down after hours of focused labor. First, Thomas attended to the tallow that remained in the crock. There was perhaps a quarter of the original volume left, enough for several more candles if needed, but not enough to warrant another full session of dipping. Thomas covered the crock with a clean cloth, tucking the edges down to keep out dust and insects. The cloth would also slow the cooling process, keeping the tallow liquid or semi-liquid so that tomorrow, when Thomas needed it, he could warm it quickly rather than having to melt it from a completely solid state. He moved the small brazier of coals away from the crock, carrying it back to the hearth. The coals had burned down to ash, their heat expended. Thomas dumped them into the hearth, where they joined the larger bed of coals from the main fire. These too were dying down now, as Thomas had not added fresh wood for some time. He would bank the fire properly before sleeping, ensuring that some embers would survive through the night to make tomorrow morning's fire easier to start. The iron pot that he had used for rendering tallow sat on the floor where he had placed it after straining. Now Thomas picked it up and carried it to his work area. The inside of the pot was coated with a layer of congealed tallow, the residue that had not poured out. This would need to be cleaned, or at least mostly cleaned, before the next use. Thomas had a method for this. He filled the pot about a quarter full with water and placed it back over the fire. The water would heat, and as it did, it would loosen the congealed tallow. The fat would melt and rise to the surface of the water. Later, when the pot had cooled, Thomas could simply lift off the layer of solidified tallow and dispose of it, or add it to his reserve supply. The pot itself would then be much easier to clean, requiring only a scrubbing with a rag to remove any remaining residue. While the pot heated, Thomas turned his attention to his workbench. The surface was cluttered with the detritus of the day's work. Small scraps of tallow, bits of cotton thread, the knife he had used for trimming, the bowl that had held the cracklings, various other tools and materials. He began to organize, putting each item back in its proper place. The knife he cleaned first, wiping away any traces of tallow with a cloth, then hanging it on its designated hook on the wall. The bowl he set aside to be washed. The scraps of tallow he collected into a small container that he kept for such purposes. These scraps, along with the residue from the rendering pot, would eventually be melted down and reused. There was something satisfying about this process of cleaning and organizing, of restoring order after a day of work. Thomas moved methodically, without rush, ensuring everything was in its place. A clean, organized workshop was not just aesthetically pleasing, though Thomas did find it so. It was also practical. When everything had its place, and everything was in its place, work could proceed smoothly. Time was not wasted searching for tools or materials. Energy was not expended on frustration or disorder. As Thomas cleaned, the light continued to fade. The golden afternoon glow had given way to the bluish tones of early evening. Through his window, Thomas could see that lamps and candles were being lit in windows across the street. Small points of warm light appearing in the gathering darkness, each one pushing back against the night in its own small way. The church bells rang for vespers, the evening prayer. The sound carried clearly through the cool air, marking the end of the working day for most people. Thomas paused in his cleaning to listen to the bells. There was something comforting about their sound, something that connected him to the larger community, to the rhythm of life that extended far beyond his small workshop. When the bells had finished their ringing, Thomas returned to his work. He swept the floor one more time, gathering up any small bits of debris that had accumulated during the day. Then he checked the water in his barrel. It was running low, perhaps a quarter full. Tomorrow he would need to make a trip to the well to refill it. This was a task he did every few days, carrying 2 buckets of water at a time from the communal well 2 streets away. It was heavy work, but necessary. Water was needed for washing, for cooking, for mixing with the tallow, for a dozen daily purposes. The pot of water over the fire had heated sufficiently. Thomas could see the layer of melted tallow floating on the surface. He used his thick cloth to protect his hands and lifted the pot off the fire, setting it aside to cool. By morning, the tallow would have solidified into a thin layer that he could easily remove. Thomas checked on the candles one more time, walking around to each rack and examining the hanging tapers. They were cooling nicely, their surfaces now completely hard to the touch. By tomorrow morning, they will be ready for the final steps, removing the lead weights, trimming the wicks to the proper length, and cutting the bases flat so the candles would stand properly in holders. But that was tomorrow's work. For now, the day's labor was essentially complete. Thomas felt the familiar tiredness that came at the end of a productive day, a deep weariness in his muscles and bones, but also a sense of satisfaction. The work had gone well. He had produced good candles. Tomorrow he would sell them, and the cycle would continue. As darkness settled over Norwich, Thomas prepared his simple evening meal. He cut more bread from his loaf, now quite hard but still edible when broken into smaller pieces. He had a small amount of pottage left from 2 days ago, thick with peas and onions, which he warmed in a pot over the fire. The pottage was perhaps past its best, but not yet spoiled. Thomas ate frugally, wasting nothing. He lit one of his own candles, one he had made several days ago, and placed it in a simple iron holder on his workbench. The flame flickered to life, casting its warm light across the workspace. Thomas sat on his bench, eating his simple meal by candlelight, the same way countless people throughout the town were eating their evening meals at this very moment. The workshop was quiet now, peaceful. Outside, the sounds of the day had faded. The street was mostly silent, with only occasional footsteps or voices breaking the stillness. The cold of night was settling in, and people were staying inside, gathered around their own fires, eating their own meals, living their own small lives. Thomas finished eating and sat for a while in the candlelight, simply resting. Not thinking of anything in particular, just being present, allowing his body to relax after the day's exertions. His hands rested on his knees. His breathing was slow and steady. The candle flame moved gently, never quite still, casting shifting shadows on the walls. After a time, Thomas rose and began his final preparations for sleep. He checked the fire, banking it carefully with ash to preserve the coals through the night. He covered the window openings with their wooden shutters, closing out the cold night air. He checked that his door was securely latched. Then he took his candle and climbed the ladder to his sleeping loft. The space up here was smaller than the workshop below, barely large enough for his bed and a small chest that held his few possessions. But it was his private space, his refuge at the end of each day. Thomas set the candle on the small shelf beside his bed and began to undress. He removed his outer tunic, his hose, his shoes, folding each item and placing it on the chest. He kept his linen under tunic on for sleeping. The nights were too cold now to sleep unclothed. He knelt briefly beside his bed, as he did every night, and spoke a short prayer. Thomas was not deeply religious, but he maintained the forms, the rituals that were expected. He prayed for his soul, for the souls of Margaret and his parents, for the town and its people, for protection through the night. The words were familiar, repeated each evening, almost automatic. Then he climbed into his bed, pulling the heavy woolen blankets up over himself. The bed was cold initially, but his body heat would warm it soon. Thomas lay on his back, looking up at the dark beams of the roof, visible in the dim light of his single candle. He thought about tomorrow. He would wake in darkness, as he always did. He would start his fire, as he always did. He would have his simple breakfast. Then he would remove the finished candles from their racks, prepare them for sale, and perhaps begin the process again with a new batch of tallow. The work would continue, as it always continued, day after day, season after season. But Thomas did not think about this with dread or resentment. It was simply what was. This was his life, the life he had inherited from his father, the life he had shared briefly with Margaret, the life he now lived alone. It was a small life, perhaps, circumscribed by the walls of this modest workshop, by the rhythms of a craft that had changed little over centuries. But it was his life, and it had its own integrity, its own quiet dignity. Thomas reached over and pinched out the candle flame between his wetted thumb and forefinger. The small pain of the heat barely registered. Darkness filled the loft immediately, complete and absolute. But Thomas knew this darkness, was comfortable in it. He settled deeper into his mattress, pulled the blankets closer, and closed his eyes. Sleep would come soon. The deep, dreamless sleep of honest exhaustion, of a body that had worked hard and now demanded rest. And tomorrow, when he woke in darkness once again, the cycle would begin anew, the making of light, the pushing back of a darkness, the simple, necessary work of a candlemaker's life. And in this work, repeated daily without fanfare or recognition, there was something quietly heroic. Not the heroism of battles or grand deeds, but the heroism of persistence, of showing up each day to do the work that needed doing. The heroism of making something useful, something that would bring light to others in their own small worlds. Outside, the town slept. Candles burned in windows here and there, each one made by someone like Thomas, each one serving its small purpose. Each one holding back the darkness for a while longer. And tomorrow, the work would begin again, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, until the world changed so much that candlemakers were no longer needed. But that time was far in the future, unimaginably distant. For now, Thomas slept in his workshop in Norwich, in the year 1347, in the month of November. And the candles he had made hung in his workshop, cooling and hardening, waiting to fulfill their purpose. Rest now. The day is done. The work is complete. Tomorrow will bring new work, but tomorrow is not yet here. For now there is only rest, only the deep peace of labor completed, only the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent.